So as I said, welcome to Emergency Plans, a primer. You are joined today by myself, Anastasia Matiku. I am a program manager for the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, and I have with me Diani Feiga, the Director of Preservation Services at the Conservation Center, as well as Emily Johnson and Jennifer Ortiz coming from the Office of Museum Services. Gianni will be presenting a vast majority of our content today, really covering the basics of an emergency plan and taking us a bit more in depth into the Council of State Archivists Pocket Response Plan. After that, we'll be breaking up into discussion groups where the four of us will be helping and answering any questions that you might have about the prep, as well as just integrating it into your day-to-day work at an institution. Gianni, can you do the next slide, please? So before we dive into the content, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. This program is a part of the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts Regional Heritage Stewardship Program. The program is an initiative that's funded through the National Endowment for the Humanities that's pursued in close partnership in this region with the Utah Division of Arts and Museums and Utah Humanities. The RHSP program is an initiative focused on bringing preservation education and resources to the Intermountain West region of the United States. Although many participants in these webinars are often coming from other regions. I do believe we have a good showing of Utah participants this week, which will be great when we start diving into some of the components of the prep specifically. So as you might have already noticed, this event is set up as a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar. We have this presentation portion where we will keep you all muted. You can feel free to turn off your camera as you please. We are recording. And then once we finish the presentation portion, we will be pausing the recording and we will be encouraging all of you to engage with us in a discussion level in breakout rooms. As we go through, please feel free to drop any questions you have into the chat. We'll make sure to have dedicated time at the end for questions in addition to the discussion groups. And with that, I will pass it off to Diani.
Oh, we jump right into my disaster slides. Whoops. Hi, everyone. As Anastasia mentioned, my name is Diani Feiga. I'm the Director of Preservation Services at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. We're a nonprofit organization. Our office is based in Philadelphia, but we're really a national organization. And as Anastasia mentioned, we do a great deal of preservation, education, and training. And with that, we also focus a good deal on emergency preparedness. So what I'm going to talk about this morning, first, I'm going to give some kind of horror slides focused on, why should we be preparing for emergencies and disasters. I'm going to explain a bit about emergency preparedness and response plans writ large, and then I'm going to really go through the pocket response plan, which you should have received as an attachment when you got the link for this workshop. So you might want to have that, open or available on your computer for while we go into the breakout session at the end. But I am really going to dive right in. With that, I'm going to turn off my video so we can just kind of focus on the slides. But yeah, so as far as why should we be concerned about preparing for emergencies and disasters, I'm just going to walk through some of the types of horrible incidents that unfortunately can and have occurred at cultural institutions. So on this slide, jumping right in, on the left is an aerial photo of the Los Angeles Public Library from an incident of arson in 1986. 400,000 items were completely destroyed. 800,000 items were wet and subsequently frozen. Freezing items will kind of stop damage from progressing, though it's not a solution in and of itself because you do still have to eventually unthaw and dry the objects. But in this instance, fortunately, 95% of the frozen materials were returned to the shelves. The image on the right is a scene from inside the library. The way that their building was constructed, they had stacks of tiered metal floors, which actually served as somewhat of a flue for the fire and smoke. This institution did not have a fire sprinkler system in place, so many objects did burn. And even if they didn't burn, a number of objects were also affected by instant embrittlement because of the heat, and the resulting smoke and soot everywhere was especially difficult to clean up. Arson is tricky. The arsonist is not always the easiest to recognize, and the motivation may be obscure. It may be purely a crime of chance, of opportunity. They usually strike when the building is closed. Automatic sprinkler systems and fire detection systems are extremely important elements that an institution can use to minimize the risk of a devastating fire from arson. Potential water damage from an errant sprinkler is a lot better than a full loss of collections. And then the final thing I'll say on this is, according to the National Fire Protection Agency, fire happens in a library every day and a half. I'm not sure if that statistic has changed in the past year or so, that the openness of libraries has been impacted somewhat, but really that's quite an astounding statistic. And libraries are the type of cultural institution that are unfortunately most likely to be impacted by arson related fire. Public libraries often have, more individuals just kind of spending time in or around them, and other institutions might have slightly greater barriers to entry. This is, of course, another fire incident. This is an example of an accidental arson at the San Diego Aerospace Museum in Balboa Park in February 1978. 3 kids set a trash can on fire next to the building. The fire spread to the wall. The fire resulted in a complete loss of the Aerospace Museum, which contained vintage airplanes, mementos, and artifacts, as well as a library and archives. Even a fire suppression system inside might have done little to protect that structure, which was 62 years old and entirely made of wood. On the right, you can see here all that was left of the museum. Some searchers were hunting for military medals with metal detectors. Fires are definitely events that can be cited to get administrative attention. It's so easy for the loss after a fire to be catastrophic, and there's a lot that can be done through proper planning to avoid it. This example is from Wisconsin. In January of 2008, a heat gun being used to remove paint from a 3rd floor wall sparked the fire at the Marathon County Historical Society's museum. Fortunately, no collections were harmed, as they were actually being stored off-site during that construction period, but $100,000 worth of damage was done to the historic building. Construction is really a frequent cause of electrical and other fires in cultural institutions, construction and renovation. Contractors might use heaters, mechanical equipment, and torches. Potentially dangerous situations include the installation of heating, ventilation, and air conditioning equipment, HVAC systems, as well as roof replacements, plumbing, and, like in this instance, paint removal. Now, and I believe it was an insurance agent told me that if just 2 steps were taken daily during renovation projects, almost all these electrical fires could be prevented. And it's actually the exact same step, just at different times of day. And that step is a simple but comprehensive walkthrough. A quick walkthrough should be done as soon as contractors leave for the day, and then again about an hour and a half later, if possible. Contractors might work, a slightly earlier schedule than an organization's open hours. So if you are still around later, it can be really helpful to do that again. Immediate problems would be identified during the first tour, and then potential slow smoldering fires would be detected on the second. So hopefully that is an indication of how, you know, small changes in procedures and policies and activities can really make a big difference. Certainly other events, not just a fire, can be catastrophic and a total loss. The Rockport Center for the Arts in Texas had been in this blue Victorian house, you can see on the left, since 1983. It was a donation from a family that had actually lived there since 1870. And this is just a reminder that just because a building has been somewhere for a long time doesn't mean it's indestructible. This building was hit dead on by Hurricane Harvey in August of 2017. In March of 2018, the building was deemed unsalvageable, and it was sadly razed in early May of 2018. This is from the Hagley Museum in Delaware. Hurricanes, as we just mentioned, saw, you know, a particular type of hurricane damage in the last slide. Hurricanes also can frequently bring flooding, as well as high winds. And high winds are definitely an element of tornadoes to be aware of, which can cause all types of problems. The Hagley is right next to the bank of a river, which you can see in that kind of lower right-hand image overflowed. And unfortunately, while they were dealing with the floodwaters, a tree branch flew through their roof. So kind of couldn't catch a break there. An additional point about floodwaters is that they are gross. This is from the University of Hawaii and Manoa during a flood that happened there in 2004. There were heavy rains, which again caused a river to jump its banks, and floodwaters cut through the center of campus. The main library first floor, which is below grade, which means that it's downhill or possibly underground, filled with water, completely destroying the acquisition and cataloging departments, as well as government documents and maps, and the space where the library school met. And you can really tell in this image just how dirty everything is from the floodwaters. Floodwaters can carry dirt, chemicals, hazardous materials. Really, if you're dealing with a flood situation, you need to kind of go in for the assumption, with the assumption that all water is potentially toxic, and even potentially sewage is involved as well. This is from another flooding incident. This is from the Colorado State University in Fort Collins in 1997. Another instance where the first floor of this library was below grade, and in addition to that, the ground around it was recessed. So it essentially turned into a moat during the heavy rain. The image all the way on the left-hand side is the high water mark, the darker beige. Water inside the building was halfway up the lower level windows of what is basically their basement, but water on the outside reached above the first floor. And unfortunately, as with many organizations, they stored a great deal of material in the basement. The shelving in the middle photo is a compact shelving unit. The force of the water actually drove the shelving off of its tracks, which of course added some access and safety challenges after the fact. And then the image on the right shows just how much water books in particular can take on as they swelled up and expanded on their shelves and formed these arch formations. That was not at all staged. That is how the books on the shelves looked after they took on a great deal of water. This is from an organization's offsite storage facility. It was a facilities problem. This organization, I'm not going to tell you who it was, but this is an offsite storage that housed archaeological materials. Like many offsite facilities, this facility was not monitored regularly. So when a hot water pipe burst, the room had quite some time to flood before it was noticed. Everything on the lowest shelves, approximately 1,400 boxes, was submerged in water. Mold outbreaks can be considered an emergency and possibly even a disaster. It's an extreme hazard as exposure to it can be limited, which makes it a challenge to clean up. The image on the left is from a library after yet another HVAC system failure. The slightly less major outbreak on the right was from actually an intentional HVAC shutdown that occurred over the weekend. You can see the white fuzz around the spines of the books just starting to grow. So mold can cause a disaster situation from something as relatively seemingly benign as an HVAC system being shut down over the weekend. Talk about an emergency escalating to a disaster. Earthquakes are definitely something we need to keep in mind. This is from the UCLA library after an earthquake. The stacks on the left, the shelving units themselves, were secured, but just about all of the books actually shook off of the shelves. The flat files in that middle image were not secured, and we can see that they fell as well. And I also want to point out on the right that in that earthquake, the lights fell as well. So sometimes we have to consider more kind of structural issues in addition to just immediate collections circumstances. Things can fall because of passing vibrations or earthquakes, but accidents do occur as well. And in certain circumstances, a really terrible accident could be considered an emergency or disaster, depending on the damage. This is from the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, England in 2006. This is an example of a risk that was unfortunately overlooked. A museum visitor tripped on their shoelaces, tumbled down a set of stairs, and crashed into a set of three 300-year-old vases that had just been sitting essentially on a windowsill at the bottom of the staircase for a good 40 years. So, you know, just a reminder to take a good critical look at how your collections are secured, either in storage or on exhibit. So I'm going to move now into talking about disaster plans now that we are all terrified about all the horrible things that could happen at our institution. Sorry, just wanted to check and see if there were any chats. If you do have a question, you can go ahead and pop it in the chat box now. It might take, I know sometimes when we're just typing, it takes a little while longer. So I'm actually, in the interest of time, I'm going to start talking through this slide, but feel free to interject a question in the chat box as well. So we are all terrified about the horrible things that could potentially happen at our institutions. We've discussed, just very much scratched the surface of things we would need in order to be prepared. And I will remind you as well, I know Anastasia included this in the participant reminder email, but we do have other resources that go a lot more in depth on risk assessments, you know, the kind of anatomy of an emergency plan and justifications for emergency preparedness, but wanted to just give kind of a surface scratch here. But let's talk, and this will be a bit of a shallow dive as well into the anatomy of how to create a disaster plan. I do want to point out that one area where there are a lot more resources related to emergency preparedness is our website, the ccaha.org. Under the resources tab, there is lots of information on emergency planning, from suggested supply lists to add to emergency supply kits, to a list of suggested vendors, or at least kind of what to look for in identifying vendors. And as I mentioned, there are links through our website, but they live on our YouTube channel, to recorded webinars that give even more of an in-depth intro to emergency response and preparedness. So please check out that for more information if you would like to. So to begin, you were sent a sample outline from a disaster plan, and this is actually from the CCAHA plan template that we use for our own organizational plan. We use as a baseline template when we're working with organizations to create emergency plans. And I'm going to focus most of our discussion on the 3 areas that you see starred on this slide. And then we're going to go, as Anastasia mentioned, we're going to go more deeply into discussing the pocket response plan. And I don't think if I have it opened correctly, I don't think I see any chat questions. So I'm going to go ahead and close the chat box, but feel free to pop in questions as we go along. And we'll definitely get that opportunity to actually talk at the end of the session. So for the purposes of creating a plan, one of the most important things to identify ahead of time is who has the responsibilities, who is doing what, when, and where right off the bat. In any circumstance, time is always of the essence, and you definitely don't want to lose time trying to, figure out, well, whose responsibility is this? Whose responsibility is this? So identifying those roles ahead of time is really critical. And that's one of the most critical parts of any emergency plan. And it's a big part of the pocket response plan as well. So in putting together a plan for your organization, before even getting into potential disaster scenarios, you want to break down decisions like where you will evacuate to, where you will meet up, both on-site and off-site, what to do if you can't evacuate and meet up, who's in charge, and generally a big breakdown of the disaster team roles and responsibilities. And I would definitely recommend for this using the incident command system for organizing who is doing what. To be very brief, if there's anyone here, and I wouldn't necessarily expect anyone would be deeply familiar with the incident command system, but certainly maybe. But so I won't go into a huge amount of detail, but I will just want to let you know that ICS, which is the organizational chart that you see here, is the way that the military and FEMA organize emergency response. So it's the system for responding that is basically being used by the highest level entities who are dealing with emergencies in our country. I think it's really helpful for us at cultural heritage organizations to know about it, just in case we would ever need to interact with people on a larger scale. But also, it's not just used by those very high level responders. It's used by police departments, fire departments, and it's used by those agencies for a reason. It provides a really thoughtful and thorough response. I could definitely teach a day-long workshop on ICS, and in fact, you can take free ICS training from FEMA online if you're interested in knowing more. If you just go to the FEMA.gov website, You can find and search for Incident Command System. You can find the free training they have available online. I would also definitely recommend, if you're interested in learning more, a book by David Carmichael. He wrote the book when he was the state archivist of Georgia, and he's actually now the state archivist in Pennsylvania. But he wrote a book called Implementing the Incident Command System at the Institutional Level, specifically for, I'm trying to get the chat box back because I was going to pop the title in there. Well, no, oh, okay. I'm gonna just definitely recommend checking that out. It was designed for libraries and archives. That's kind of where his expertise lies, but it's completely relevant for museums and other historic sites too. You might just need to swap in and out some semantics. So definitely, if you want to learn more about that, I would check that out. Next up, I've just listed some of the emergency situations that we have identified as possibilities for the CCAHA office based in Philadelphia. Obviously, this list is going to look different for everyone. One of the steps of identifying the types of emergency situations that you might need to be prepared for is by undertaking a risk assessment for your site. And as I mentioned, we do have a whole recorded webinar on risk assessments in particular, and there are a number of other resources out there, but that's an important step too. So we've determined kind of who has the responsibility. Now we need to determine, well, what do we need to be prepared for? And then a full comprehensive emergency plan would walk through the plans and procedures for each of these potential incidents. Salvage is another topic we could spend literally days on. And in fact, when we are back able to meet again in person and doing workshops, one of the types of workshops that we at the Conservation Center really enjoy running is simulated salvage workshops. But just a few points I want to mention here. Something that you'll really want and need to think of ahead of time. Again, one of those like pre-planning decision conversations are priorities, collections priorities. Often in disasters, you just physically cannot save it all. So you will need to make some really hard decisions. It's crucial to have some idea of what your guidelines will be. So, what are the materials that are most important to the institution? Which ones have the highest monetary value? Which ones have the highest levels of other types of value? Monetary value is not the only value that we care about as cultural collecting organizations. Which objects are most sensitive to water and vulnerable to other types of damage? So these are all criteria that you might use and might have to have a pretty extensive institutional conversation about. You'll also want to be thinking about the procedures that you'll use to be keeping track of items as they move around during a disaster. It's so easy to lose track of things in the chaos. And then lastly, perhaps the most important part of this is you'll want to have some guidelines on how actually to do the salvage. Again, this is something that there are many other resources on. Again, on the CCAHA website, we have some in-depth guides on salvaging, particular types of collections materials. Some of the resources are broken down by material type. Some are broken down by materials that are safe and not safe to freeze, because that's an important consideration. And then lastly, I want to just talk a bit about the appendices of a disaster plan. This section often included physically towards the end of the plan, if we're thinking of a binder or something. This section is helpful for the areas that will be changing most often. You don't want to have to rifle through your whole plan to update, for example, staff contact information every time someone moves or there's a new hire. So these are just some of the examples that we use in the lists section of the CCAHA plan. And then forms like lists may need to be pulled out so you can make lots of copies of them during the disaster. You might need forms to, for example, we were talking about keeping track of where objects are moving to. So again, it's helpful to have them toward the back and easily accessible without disrupting the rest of the plan. You can find a lot of form templates. The book that is pictured here has lots of good examples, but you may use forms for other purposes already, like an incident report form for if there's a non-collections related incident that occurs at your organization or something. So, no need to completely reinvent the wheel if there are certain forms and templates that you're already using. And of course, maps. These are probably a little more stable and could also be integrated into the more static part of your plans, but they are also handy to be able to make copies of and distribute quickly if needed. I work with lots of institutions that don't have floor plans or don't have really accurate floor plans, but they are really helpful for a lot of reasons. So definitely, if that's something that your organization lacks or that you might not have access to as a collections staff member, definitely look into that, because that's a really critical, integral part of an emergency plan. And then you would use, when we have these maps, so the evacuation and shelter in place locations might be off-site, but all of the other location guides, those are going to use your floor plan as a baseline. So without an accurate floor plan, you can't really identify where the fire extinguishers are, where supplies are located. Another priority or another map that I might add here might be locations of priority collections, if you have gone through the process of identifying those. All right, and now we are into what is kind of the meat of the program today. I have to warn you, my slides and even my talk in this section is going to be pretty dry, but it's important to just go through all the steps and everything that is included in this pocket response plan, because that's what we're really gathered here today to discuss. So putting together all of the information that we just talked about definitely seems overwhelming. And as I mentioned a couple times, there's way more detail that could go into describing a comprehensive emergency plan that we barely even visited today. But the prep is a tool to simplify a little bit that tendency to be overwhelmed by a vast amount of information. So this is where we're going to focus our discussion on for the rest of the session today. But again, I do want to just give the opportunity to pause and see if there are questions in the chat. Whoops. Every time I try to access the chat, I go haywire. All right. Well, I don't see any, so I'm going to move on. So the pocket response plan, the template that we use, that we sent out a copy of, it was developed by the Council of State Archivists. So that is, I mean, really just what it sounds like. Every state has their own an archivist who's kind of in charge of the archives for that state. And then there is a group of the state archivists that meets on a routine basis and talks about, you know, issues facing government archives, but also issues facing all of the archives throughout their states, because there is often somewhat of a mandate for that type of responsibility as well. So they developed this really, really fantastic tool template. The prep, I do need to give the caveat, because I wouldn't be a responsible preservation educator if I didn't, but the caveat that it is intended to be a first step in disaster preparedness. It's not meant to replace a full comprehensive plan, but rather to complement it. So that's my soapbox. That's kind of what I have to say, but I will say, I'll get off my soapbox and say, having completed a prep is so much better than nothing. That I think that saying it's like the first step in an emergency preparedness effort really undersells the importance of this type of tool and this type of work. But it is, whether you're using it as your planning focus or as a complement to a more extensive plan, it's a really easy way to go through and gather a lot of the information needed to create your disaster plan. And it's intended to be a guide for what you would need in the first 48 hours of responding to an emergency or disaster. So if you print the prep out, which I definitely recommend doing, they can fold up accordion style and then fit essentially anywhere. The COSA website, I'm not sure if they still do, but they actually used to sell these little Tyvek envelopes that you could buy, you know, custom fit for the folded up prep, or you can slip them into your ID badge holder, your wallet, wherever makes sense that you're going to be able to carry with you. This is really something that's meant to be carried with you. And then the person in the image on the lower right had highlighted some of the areas of the prep that she needed the most. All right, so this is where I warned it's going to be pretty dry, at least in terms of slide content for a couple minutes now, but it's important information, so bear with me. If you have the document open, you don't have to have it open right now. I definitely encourage you to open up the one that you were sent when we go into the breakout section. But basically, it's meant to be printed on two sides of one sheet of paper. So side A is all focused on communications, and then side B is all focused on the actual response procedures and actions themselves. And again, if you're not looking at it, the way that it's broken down is a series of columns on each side. So just working through the columns. First, we have the institutional contacts section. Use the template that we gave you as a guide for thinking about the people and the groups that should be contacted in the event, in the first 48 hours of an emergency or disaster. So it lists staff titles, it lists, you know, director, facilities person, security person, etc. But for your purposes, I really encourage you to customize the prep as much as you are able, that is, delete entries that don't apply or make sense, add them that do, or combine. Like if at your organization, the facilities person and security person are actually the same person, don't need to list them twice. If you're working in a very, very small organization that relies on, maybe you only have one or two or a handful of staff members and have rely a great deal upon consistent volunteers, list them on there too. It doesn't have to be paid staff. We're really thinking about who are the institutional contacts that need to be apprised. Definitely recommend including multiple modes of contact, especially for key people, the people who are the most important to get in touch with. I think this used to be more important to point out before we all just completely relied upon cell phones, and we would say, make sure you have the person's cell phone and their home phone number. But now I would say maybe make sure you have their cell phone and their email address or something. Put the most specific number you can. Don't use letters, and make sure that if you're dealing with like an office phone number or something, use full phone numbers, not just extensions. I mentioned email addresses. I would definitely recommend find out folks' home email address, non-work email address, as well as their work email. Sometimes if it's on the weekend, many of us try not to check our work email for a couple days there. So want to try and make sure that you can get in touch with the most critical people. Bear in mind that text can sometimes be more reliable than phone calls, especially in a widespread regional incident. And also have to have a plan for after hours emergencies. So there might be different considerations in this institutional contacts field for, a Wednesday at noon versus a Saturday at 10 p.m. So, who is actually at the site after hours, if anyone? There's also the disaster team section on the front side of the prep. So this is going to be redundant to the institutional contacts, but this is where you need to identify, I would say 4 to 8 people who have the ultimate responsibility for responding to disasters. So it might not be the same as the list of institutional contacts. It might be your emergency response team might have a lot more collections focus than directors or administrators or whatnot. And hopefully that'll make more sense again when you're actually looking at the prep. One thing I want to mention, this hopefully goes without saying, but just have to mention it. Don't put anything confidential print anything confidential on the prep, because remember, this is meant to be printed out and carried around. So you definitely don't want to include pins or passwords or anything. Next, I want to talk a little bit about utilities. So, definitely look up the 24-hour numbers for companies like gas, water, and electric companies. If you have contractors on the list, and it's a good idea to identify contractors who you would call, whether it's HVAC contractors or building contractors. Let them know that they're on your list. You might assume that they would assume, but it's a nice gesture to just make sure they realize, we're listing you. We might call you in the event of an emergency. Then we have first responders. So the easiest way, of course, to reach first responders is just dialing 911. And a lot of times that is the ultimate first step. And that's something that you would, that's in filling out the prep, this is not the time to necessarily make the call about, when you would call 911 versus something else that might be a slightly different conversation. What it's important to think about for this project is, it might sound a little strange, but maybe you'll know what I'm talking about in a minute. Make sure you know how to call 911. That is, if you're on an office phone, do you have to hit 9 for an outside line or whatever for an outside line, or can you just dial 911? So do you essentially have to dial 911, or can you just hit those numbers directly? When you're calling 911, make sure you know that there is a slight difference between calling from a cell phone versus a landline. They'll show up differently on the 911 operating system, and it may be difficult for them to find your location. So just make sure, something to have in mind is make sure you're ready to give directions to first responders to get to you. This might particularly be the case if your address is a little misleading. If your organization is in an office park or in a park system or something, where maybe your mailing address or your GPS, the address that would show up if you just plugged it into a GPS system, would be a little misleading. So be prepared to give detailed instructions. So you would, on your prep document, I would recommend identifying the county emergency management agencies as well as your state emergency management agencies. I know that the folks from the Jennifer and Emily are going to go through some of the resources in Utah in particular in a little bit. Additionally, there's FEMA. They're probably not going to be a really early call, but it's helpful to know where to go. So for FEMA, you want to know which region you're in. The country is split up into, I believe it's 9 different FEMA regions. And even if you're not in a federal disaster, it might be helpful to speak with someone to have them direct you to resources. FEMA and state emergency agencies have environmental and historic representatives, and those people are good to know anyway for emergency planning. Next up, we have emergency recovery services. So this is one where you're going to be listing out vendors and service providers that, other than first responders, might actually come respond to an incident, such as a freezer company, or even suppliers of archival and other collections supply materials. It's a good start to just kind of look at lists and find those companies and service providers, but there still can be a lot of relationship building and communications to be established. So, I wouldn't recommend just picking a freezer company off the list and then popping them on your prep. You would need to call the companies, see what services they offer, ideally establish a relationship ahead of time. And again, as with the contractors, let them know that you're putting them on the list. The AIC, the American Institute for Conservation's website, has a Find a Conservator database on their website, and you can search in that by disaster recovery services, as well as by specialty and zip code. So you could contact conservators or trained collection specialists through that, who are specifically trained in emergency response. Also, connected with AIC is the NHR team, the National Heritage Responders. This is a team of, again, conservators, collections management specialists, et cetera, who are specially trained in collections salvage. They won't come for emergency response, but they're great for calling in with questions and can come later for assessment and recovery. CCAHA, we serve as emergency responders. Now for the Intermountain West, it's probably not cost effective for us to actually come be part of the response. But again, Jennifer and Emily are going to go over some resources at least in Utah, but we are definitely available longer term for help over the phone and again, resources and questions, assistance. We have a number of conservators on our staff who would be glad to talk for hours about salvaging particular types of collections materials. I also mentioned freezers. So you might have to think kind of creatively about spaces that have a freezer that would be acceptable for collections storage. So you don't necessarily want to, like a food service company they're going to have freezers. They're going to be storing food in freezers, but you don't want to necessarily store collections alongside that. So check universities and see, your university libraries might have freezers or might have access to where nearby freezers that are acceptable for collections might be. There are definitely national response companies like Belfour and Polygon who will do just about all types of recovery services as well. And many of them, it's going to vary location by location, but many of them have specially trained staff for dealing with collections. So that's great. This is definitely an area where, again, I recommend establishing relationships with companies like this ahead of time to find out kind of what they will do and how they'll go about it. Companies like ServPro and Stanley Steamer, they are definitely good to know about for things like furnishings, carpets, wallboard, etc., but not so much for collections areas. So it might be helpful on the prep to differentiate between what are the disaster response vendors that we're going to go to for collections related problems versus just like this room that doesn't necessarily have collections in it, but it's filled with water and mold. Mold testing labs can be a really excellent resource to have on hand. As well. Next up is regional contacts, which, most of the things, and again, you'll see when you're actually looking at the prep, it identifies you would want to list where your state archive is. Even if you're not an archival organization, it's still really helpful to know where they are, what their contact is, and what, if any, kind of services they provide. Who is your state historic preservation representative? So most of this is going to be just kind of accessible through Googling, but yet again, Jennifer and Emily might be able to fill you in more. And then last on this side, we have the staff phone tree. So this is, you notice we started out with institutional contacts and now we're coming back to the phone tree. And so this, again, it's going to be kind of redundant information, but in a slightly different order. So the purpose of a phone tree is having staff members and volunteers be able to contact each other and inform each other of what's going on. So it is critically important to have an up-to-date phone list of basically anyone who might be on site or potentially coming on site, staff, volunteers, interns, student employees in an academic setting. If you have a really large staff and the whole list wouldn't fit on, the whole phone tree wouldn't fit on the prep plan, list perhaps HR contacts or supervisors on here instead. And then there can be another resource where you're breaking it out into more complete information. Make sure everyone knows how the phone tree works. So, you know, if what do they do if the person they're supposed to call doesn't answer? Do they leave a message and call the next person on the list? Do they just call the next person on the list and have some system for circling back to the previous person, et cetera, et cetera? So just establish those procedures in advance. All right, so we're halfway done with that. The backside of the prep is actually a little bit quicker. Let's see, sorry. I'm clearly Zoom challenged today because I'm trying to find the chat box again, but cannot get it. So, just to make sure. And I skip through the end to the end again. All right. Again, if you have questions, go ahead and pop them in the chat. Like I said, this half is going to go a little bit quicker than the last half, so we're closing in on the time where we can break out and actually have a discussion. So the backside of the prep document deals with actions. And remember, this is another area that it is the prep itself, the template is easily modified. You can delete entries that don't apply to your organization and add those that do. So just use this version as a guide for thinking about the actions that are appropriate for you. Column 1 deals with immediate response. So this is the type of information that should also be posted once we're back in our facilities full time again, or maybe some of us currently are, posted by telephones, posted throughout the space. So this is a list of information like who to call. Try not to just list one name in that who to call column. You could put the entire disaster team and then list the members on the verso, or even attach the prep when posting it by the phone. Security is listed as a first step here because it's so important in emergencies. Securing the building to prevent unauthorized entry and exit is critically important. You need to secure both the building and the collections. And you may need, depending on the incident, you may need to prevent people from going back into a building that has not yet been cleared. Folks might want to retrieve personal items like car keys or purses, but really, if it's not cleared for re-entry, you cannot do that. So talk about this with your staff ahead of time. Set up a perimeter around the building or have staff manning each access point. While in the process of immediate response, and I know this might sound premature, but it's really important, start compiling an initial situation report, which is also included on the document as well at the bottom right corner on side B. So these are questions that will help you in communicating your needs, as well as will help you in reporting to emergency responders. Column 2 is assessment. And this is when you're able to re-enter and you're walking through the space and evaluating the potential damage. To the extent that you can afford, I recommend going slow with this. The time you spend here will determine how well the rest of the response and recovery goes. So I usually recommend coming up with some kind of standardized sheet to send people into a site and conduct an assessment like this. There are models of these types of sheets out there. or you can make up your own. But whatever you do, don't send someone in with a blank pad of paper. Include specific questions like what, where, type of damage, and how much. And remember to take pictures. They don't have to be anything artful, professional. Just take snapshots. They are probably going to be required by your insurance company if you're filing an insurance claim. Have your phone and or a digital camera, a separate digital camera handy with a flash, or you can use the flashlight on your phone when the power is out to see the extent of the damage. And then another recommendation is possibly even taking a video with voiceover oral commentary of what is shown as well. Anything to help you remember and kind of be able to reorient you later to know what you're looking at when you're looking at the snapshots. So we definitely talked about kind of who to communicate with on side A, but on side B, we're actually mapping out procedures and strategies for communications. This is something that needs to be established pretty quickly in order for things to go smoothly. So everything that's listed on the plan are important factors to think about, but also just simply, how are you communicating with staff? Are you sending out a series of texts to perhaps staff and volunteers who aren't involved in the immediate response? Okay, I did see that chat. Excellent. So at least I know it's working. I'm just going to pause. I'll get to that question in 1 second. Just want to talk through the rest of the communicating with folks. Can you set up like a command center or a central location to gather information and to deploy staff to various tasks? That could be done inside or outside the building based on the level of structural damage, environmental conditions, etc. So you want to have backup locations in mind. And then also, again, we talked about this a little bit previously, but think ahead about possible meeting areas and availability of services near your building if you do have to set up offsite. You'll also want to think about who is communicating with the outside world. So have a plan prepared ahead of time on who will talk to the media. You want one voice instead of multiple stories about what is going on, which could cause challenges down the line. And don't assume if any of you are from really small organizations, don't assume that because you're from a small organization that there may not be any media attention or the media wouldn't care. I mean, if there's a disaster, even to a small museum site, historic site, the local news could be very interested in that. So come up with a plan for how to handle that. So Rachel asked in the chat a really great question. Should you have pre-emergency photo and video documentation? Well, so that's an excellent question. And where the should comes in, I'm not sure, for insurance purposes, that would be a question that you would need to discuss with your insurance agents, brokers, et cetera. So, just what type of kind of before and after images they need in order to make an assessment of damage, that's kind of a different thing. But as far as for your own knowledge, yeah, I think it's fantastic to have images of collections essentially in situ, even if it's not anything that's going to be formally, it's not necessarily something that's going to be kept in your objects database or anything, but I think it could be really helpful to just have some snapshots of your space the way that things normally look. That is something, so when I know we at the Conservation Center, and I know there are some some of the state agencies in Utah do this as well when we do like preservation needs assessments or different types of collections assessments. One of the things that we often include is photos of just, you know, the way things are. So kind of capturing a moment in time. So that can be definitely helpful for assessing damage. Now, it's one of many things that has to be kind of fit into a large list of priorities, but definitely a great idea if you can fit it in. So yeah, thanks for that question, Rachel. Moving on. So the collection salvage part of the prep. So using the result of the assessments done in that previous column and the priority of your damaged collections that you have ideally established in advance, use that information to guide your collections salvage efforts. Remember, it's important, I should be mentioning this in every step of the actions, but I'll mention it now. It's always ultimately important to consider health and human safety, especially at this stage, and try to mitigate hazards to personal health and safety and use proper protection for your workers. That's going to be particularly important when it comes to salvaging collections, because that's when you're getting to the point of, you know, touching things and potentially being in a space that's less than ideal. So think ahead about what your staff is capable of and their needs. Who else might be available to be called in for relief? Mutual aid agreements and assistance from networks like Alliance for Response networks can be especially beneficial in just finding human body power to work with collections. You can use staff who have been trained in proper salvage techniques as team leaders for small groups that are maybe being trained on the job. Also, when thinking about supplies and equipment, think not only about the supplies needed for pack out, but the creature comfort supplies for these individuals doing the actions, providing plenty of water and breaks with healthy, energy restoring snacks. You might need to bring in porta potties and other facilities considerations. If you're going to have folks on site for hours at a time, provide meals if possible. Now, we talked about this already, and I'm not going to go into a huge amount of greater detail about it, but I will just say again, this is something that will need to be done well ahead of time. It can take years for organizations to kind of come to an agreement on what are the priorities. I would definitely recommend assembling a team of people with an understanding of the collection, establish criteria. The goal is to figure out what types of value you are going to be considering, and then what types of collections or materials, maybe they're not even permanent collections, but what you can agree is not valuable, so you don't end up wasting time on it. This can be flexible, but what you cannot do is say, we have to save it all and have that be the end game, because that's just not going to be feasible in some circumstances. Sadly, unfortunately, I wish that it could always be, but the kind of refusal to give thought to identifying priorities can be really detrimental down the road. So you have some choices to make in terms of how to identify high priority materials. Are they physically marked with reflective tape that will glow when the power's out? Are they marked on floor maps, as we discussed a little bit? Keep in mind that earthquake slides and some of the slides about floods, what you identify might not end up being where it's supposed to be. So you might want to have different kind of modes of identifying materials. And then finally, I will just mention again, the final column on the prep side B lists out the ICS authority structure. You really will only have to use this in a large scale disaster. I mean, very large, in order to be at the level where you're dealing with external responders who are speaking in these terms. But it can be really applicable to even smaller incidents as well. And I think when we meet next week and do tabletop exercises, I think, you know, some aspects of that may become more applicable then. But I point it out because it's really important that you're familiar with it and know what is happening if something should happen and it's being used at your site. And again, there is free online training for ICS, and there's that fantastic resource about it if you want to dig into it more. But there are also kind of simpler ways of getting the information that we'll go over a little bit more. Is my presentation. Again, try to find the chat, but you're also welcome to unmute yourself and just ask a question if you want to speak a question, and then I'll just wait a few minutes or a moment or so and see if there are any questions, and then want to just switch over to hearing from the folks from Utah for a moment about some regional resources there. But I also want to say, while you're thinking of your questions and maybe even typing out questions, please feel free to contact me at any time with questions along these lines. This is a huge part of what we do at the Conservation Center. So even if we're not geographically close to y'all, I'm definitely happy to point you to resources, send you our own resources. Definitely recommend emailing rather than phone now, because I am still working remotely, and sometimes I will get a call at that number, but sometimes it's a little less reliable. Is next week's workshop a separate registration? I think it was. Anastasia, can you confirm that? Yes, it is. Yeah. But you can still register for that if you haven't already. All right, I'm going to I mean, I will be around, so feel free to ask me other questions later. But for now, I'm going to pass this along to, I'm not sure if Jen and Emily are speaking or who it is, but they will introduce themselves. So thank you, everyone, and I will be back in a few moments.
Thanks, Deani. My name is Jennifer Ortiz. As I mentioned earlier, I run the Office of Museum Services with the Utah Division of Arts and Museums, and myself and Emily Johnson, who's also on this call, do a lot of the field services and outreach. Some of you all on this call might be familiar with the work that our office does, but if not, we do all sorts of things. We're a re-granting agency, so museums and cultural organizations in Utah are eligible for our grants. We also provide professional development resources through online workshops. So in addition to what you're seeing here, we have a whole host of workshops ranging from volunteer management to collection scope and policy. So emergency preparedness is something that we are excited to delve into with CCHA through this partnership. And so we just wanted to quickly highlight a few of the resources that are available for those organizations that are in Utah. Some of these are online resources, so anybody is eligible to access them. They're just quick links. Other things are very specific to Utah's cultural organizations. So I kind of just want to quickly go through some of those resources, and then if anyone has any questions, I'd love to answer them now or in the future, especially if you haven't connected with us. Would love to get to know you and meet you all. So the first resource is a disaster preparedness plan tool. It's similar to what we are going to be working on together here as a group just after this slide. But if you wanted to see what sort of resources are available, those are on our website as a PDF, and that is a link, the blue link, it'll go directly to our website. The Alliance for Response it's a Utah forum. It's a group of people dedicated to building bridges between cultural organizations and disaster response teams in Utah. This is something, it's been dormant for a little bit, but I believe it's coming back now with ongoing conversations around disaster preparedness. And so if that's something you're interested in and you're based in Utah, definitely follow up with myself or Emily. Check it out on the website. It's good information to have. The state of Utah does have a cultural property appendix. This appendix it needs to be updated, but it's something that, again, is a resource as a reference to see what sort of cultural heritage the state is tracking. I know we have some state parks folks on this call, and so I know that's a part of the conversation. So what kind of collections are at the state level? WestPass, so it was the Western States and Territory Preservation Assistance Services group. This was a group that was funded in part by the NEH. It is no longer an operating group, but they do have a collection of webinar trainings on connecting to collections. So similar to what you would see here, just a recorded webinar or class. There are quite a few that are very specific to Western collections care practices and disaster prevention. So I highly recommend checking it out because those webinars are always great resources. And then the state of Utah has a brand new contract with the Belfour Property Restoration Services. They are, as Deani mentioned, there's a lot of companies out there. The state has a contract with Belfour. They're a company that does disaster mitigation when disasters strike, and then site visit consultations. We are currently in conversation with Belfour to get some of these site consultations out to our cultural heritage institutions across the state. So if this is something that is of interest to you, I'm currently gathering information of interested organizations within Utah. So again, specific to Utah, but this is potentially is a unique opportunity to have some of these folks come to your site. So let me know, reach out via email. I would be happy to answer some questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.